I'm Omar Ricks. I helped with putting this together. And wanted to say thank you to some people without whom this would not be possible, in case they're listening. Catherine Apostolou, Gail DeKosnik, Patrick Ellis, Susanna Flores, David Gray, Charles Henry, David Kim, Grace Leach, Zeus Leonardo, Vanessa Parker, Airdrie Stoddard, and Bianca Suarez, and Kim McNair. Thank you very much, everybody, for making this happen. And thank you all for showing. So this is, I'm just Professor Sexton, Professor Jared Sexton from UC Irvine is our honored speaker today, who who will be introduced by Professor Brandy Catanese. So thank you.
I, too, shall keep my remarks brief so that we can get to the good stuff. But it is definitely a great pleasure to welcome Professor Jared Sexton, who is Director of the Program in African American Studies at UC Irvine, to campus today. And this is actually a welcoming back of Professor Sexton because he earned his PhD in ethnic studies here at UC Berkeley before joining the faculty at Irvine. Professor Sexton's first book, Amalgamation Schemes, Anti-Blackness and the Critique of Multiracialism, was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2008, and he's currently working on several other projects, including the solo-authored work, The Shadow of a Color Line, Racial Politics Beyond Coalition, and the collaborative efforts Stand Up, The New Politics of Racial Uplift, and Conversations with David Simon. At UC Irvine, in addition to his leadership role with African American Studies, Professor Sexton is positioned as a truly interdisciplinary scholar affiliated with, among other units, the Center for Law, Society, and Culture, the Critical Theory Institute, and the Department of Film and Media Studies. Across his expansive body of published work and public presentations, Dr. Sexton's contribution to critical studies of race has consistently been locating racial blackness at the center rather than the margins of our understandings of such foundational frameworks as race, power, freedom, and even life and death, in a way that insists on the ethical and political urgency of remaining rigorous in the ways that we discuss identity, even identity politics, and allocations of critical and material resources in societies globally. So without further ado, I welcome Jared Sexton.
Okay, thank you, Professor Catanese, for the introduction, and to Omar as well for coordinating and facilitating all of the logistics that went into this, and of course all of the co-sponsoring units, and to all of you for coming out on a very hotter than expected Wednesday afternoon. As you can see, I expected it to be typical Bay Area weather. So much my years here taught me. It just goes to show that global warming is just the hoax, right, that Glenn Beck said it is, right? 100 degrees it was on the way up here. Okay, so I'll jump right into things. I should say maybe at the outset that what I'll present here today is a kind of combination or amalgamation of 2 or 3 different articles, either recently published or forthcoming. Does this sound too loud? It's okay. It's just I can hear it. Hey, Nick. The piece that the title of this talk comes from, People-of-Color-Blindness, is recently out in Social Text in 2010. And I'll also have sort of selections here from another article entitled The Curtain of the Sky, which came out in Critical Sociology last year. And the last part of this is from a piece called The Social Life of Social Death, which is forthcoming in the Canadian journal Intentions, probably sometime this fall, maybe early next spring. But that's just in case you actually want to track down what I'm saying, argue with it, adore it, whatever your response may be, but also so that we can continue the dialogue and discussion. I welcome all of that, given that the forum today will restrict us in some way. So please do email me or write me on a piece of paper if you still do that, and continue the conversation. Okay, so let me try to get this started. I'm going to start here with a one-line epigraph from the former U.S. Poet Laureate Rita Dove. This is from her poem, David Walker, 1785-1830. She writes, "We are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began." We are not the 99%. We are supernumerary. We are the uncalculated, the incalculable. We are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began. In the secondary literature on the life and work of Frantz Fanon, there is a tendency to bypass his earliest efforts to theorize the specificity of anti-black racism in favor of his supposedly more general pronouncements on the nature of all forms of racism, its historic relation to colonialism, and to the exploitation of labor. Of course, Fanon is not immune to this shift of emphasis, and there's much in his work to warrant it. Consider, for example, the following from the chapter on the so-called dependency complex of the colonized in his 1952 Black Skin, White Mask. He writes there, quote, "All forms of exploitation are alike. They all seek to justify their existence by citing some biblical decree. All forms of exploitation are identical since they apply to the same object, man. By considering the structure of such and such an exploitation from an abstract point of view, we are closing our eyes to the fundamentally important problem of restoring man to his rightful place," end quote. Now, it's critical to note that Fanon writes this not as a first principle, but rather as a rebuttal to those who would apologize for French colonialism by attempting to cast it in a relatively benign light. His position, in other words, is that all forms of exploitation are alike insofar as they are all unethical. They are all equally evil. So there is a slippage in Fanon between the universal denunciation of all exploitation and the conceptual conflation of all such suffering under the broadest heading. And this slippage, I would argue, is something which has been generalized in the field of cultural theory. This is why his moments of analytic generalization in the name of global justice contrast with his efforts in other chapters, The Lived Experience of the Black and the Black in Psychopathology, where he attempts to discern the difference between the lethal dynamics of modern anti-Semitism and Negrophobia in the long history of European colonial enterprise. Discerning does not mean disconnecting, however, for Fanon's point regards the complex interrelations between manifestations of racism within an overarching social structure. In Chapter 5 of Black Skin, Fanon writes, for instance, that, quote, "The anti-Semite is invariably a negrophobe." But he does not write that the negrophobe is inevitably an anti-Semite. Interestingly, the unidirectional nature of this link would seem to be a corollary of the hierarchical discrepancy in racial culture between the Jew and the Black in the field of vision. Whereas for Fanon, quote, "The Jewishness of the Jew can go unnoticed, and his acts and behaviors are the determining factor, the Black, in his account, is not given a second chance because he is, in the famous formulation, overdetermined from without, not a slave not to the idea others have of him, but to his appearance." The hypervisibility of the Black is an effect of the sheer corporeality attributed to the Black in the racist imagination, the over-presence of his or her tangible personality, as Fanon puts it, or actual being. Fanon writes, quote, "The Negro symbolizes the biological." And this is the case where the projective evacuation of biological existence from certain Western philosophical conceptions of intelligence denigrates the body as a permanent threat to the continuity of reason. More precisely, the biological threat is sexual in nature, and it is the unmitigated sexualization of blackness, the reduction of the Black to sexual being, to the flesh of genitalia, in fact, and the resulting blackening of sex and sexuality that characterizes negrophobia. Perhaps it goes without saying that this reduction of the body to flesh links the libidinal economy of sexual fetishism to the political economy of commodity fetishism in the most acute way. This suggests, if we follow Fanon, that while it is impossible to be anti-Semitic without also being anti-Black, in this case, it is possible, however, to be anti-Black without also being anti-Semitic, or perhaps more relevant to racial formation in the United States, without also being anti-Indian or anti-Arab or anti-Asian. In other words, one can reject without contradiction the thesis that it is best to be white, the postulate of white superiority, and even pursue the resignification and valorization of a historically disparaged Indianness or Arabness or Asianness and so forth, while endorsing in whole or in part the thesis that it is nonetheless worst to be black, the postulate of black inferiority. For Lewis Gordon, whose black existential philosophy has reframed Fanon's thought in Anglophone academic circles, at least, since Homi Bhabha's 1986 introduction to the Pluto Press edition of Black Skin, White Mask, Gordon writes, "There is no way to reject the thesis that there is something wrong with being black beyond the willingness to be black, not in terms of convenient fads of playing blackness, but by paying the social costs of anti-blackness on a global scale." What, we might ask, are these social costs, and what might it mean to pay them if they represent the price of being ethical in an anti-black world? What is this willingness to be black, of choosing to be black affirmatively rather than reluctantly, that Gordon finds as the key ethical moment in Fanon? In another article entitled Theory in Black, Gordon writes the following, I quote at length, "Theory in black is a phobogenic designation. It occasions anxiety of thought. It is theory in jeopardy. There is a form of illicit seeing at the very beginnings of seeing black, which makes the designation of seeing in black, theorizing, that is, in black, more than oxymoronic. It has the mythopoetics of sin. Blackness, in all of its metaphors and historical submergence, reaches out to theory as theory split from itself. It is the dark side of theory, which in the end is none other than theory itself, understood as self-reflective outside itself." Now, I'm guided in the following task by a two-sided idea derived from Gordon's arguments. First, all thought, insofar as it is genuine thinking, might best be conceived of as black thought. And two, all researches, insofar as they are genuinely critical inquiries, aspire to black studies. Blackness is theory itself, anti-blackness, the resistance to theory. I suspect that this premise might help us to reframe questions of theory in cultural studies by referring to or forging another criterion of evaluation. And the pedagogical thrust of this comment emerges from recurrent questions arising from my undergraduate and graduate teaching and from research conducted for the series of articles that I mentioned earlier. The questions, though they have been around for some time now, remain relatively young in the historic instance. Are there multiple forms or species of racism, or simply variations of a fundamental structure? If it is the latter, what provides the model or matrix? Colonialism, slavery, anti-Semitism, and so forth? Or is racism rather a singular history of violent conjunctures? Can anti-racist politics be approached in ways that denaturalize the color line, retain the specificities of discrepant histories, and think through their relational formation? People-of-Color-Blindness serves as an initial response to such questions and a sort of extended preface to my comments below, the article, not the talk. In that earlier article, I attempted to examine the refiguration of slavery and its afterlife, a phrase which I borrow from Saidiya Hartman, within the field of black studies, paying special attention to the theoretical status of the concept of social death since its introduction by Orlando Patterson in his synthetic 1982 study, Slavery and Social Death. For Patterson, the social death of slavery is comprised of three basic elements. First, total powerlessness. Second, natal alienation, or what he calls the loss of ties of birth in both ascending and descending generations. And third, generalized dishonor, this last element being a direct effect of the previous two. Adjudicating the explanatory power of Patterson's magnum opus, then, bears on matters of political and social theory, law and philosophy, as much as history and historiography. I attempted, in very broad outlines, to get at these matters through a reading of the critical encounter between Giorgio Agamben and Achille Mbembe that highlights some of the principal insights of Saidiya Hartman's ongoing project. So I'll turn to that now. In Means Without End, Agamben suggests that under present conditions, we will, quote, have to abandon decidedly and without reservation the fundamental concepts through which we have so far represented the subjects of the political, and build our political philosophy anew, starting from the one and only figure of the refugee. His proposal derives from a paramount concern to counteract the increasing institutionalization of what he calls the state of exception throughout the political and juridical order of the modern nation states. And it's premised on an understanding of the refugee as a limit concept, a figure that he says at once brings a radical crisis to the principles of the nation state and, more importantly, clears the way for a renewal of categories that can no longer be delayed. This urgent renewal of categories is made possible by the conceptual crisis of the nation state represented by the refugee, insofar as she disarticulates the trinity of state, nation, territory, and the very principle of the inscription of nativity upon which it's based. The refugee is the contemporary political subject par excellence because she exposes to view the originary fiction of sovereignty and thereby renders it available to thought. This is all my gloss on Agamben. So what is this fiction, this originary fiction of sovereignty? Not only the presumed identity between the human and the citizen, right? This conceptual fissure which makes possible the modern production of bare life, one of Agamben's key terms. And that between nativity and nationality, the distinction that makes possible the naturalization of both propagation and property in the name of race. It's also the conflation of the ruler or ruling class with sovereignty itself, the tautological claim that the law is ontologically prior to the establishment of its own jurisdictional field, a space defined by relations of purely formal obedience. The state of exception would seem to betray the mystical foundation of authority because the sovereign power operates in suspension of positive law, enforcing the law paradoxically insofar as it is inapplicable at the time and place of its enforcement. However, the dynamic stability of that foundation, the space of obedience, is demonstrated by the terrible fact that the state of exception has been materialized repeatedly within a whole array of political formations across the preceding century and in the particular form of the camp. With the birth of the camp, Agamben argues, the exception becomes the rule, consolidating a field of obedience in extremis. In place of rule by law, we have a paradigm of governance by the administration of the absence of order. Now, if for Agamben the camp is what he calls the new biopolitical nomos of the planet, its novelty does not escape a certain conceptual belatedness with respect to those repressed topographies of cruelty that Achille Mbembe has identified in the formulation of necropolitics. On my reading, the formulation of necropolitics is enabled by attending to the political and economic conditions of the African diaspora in the historic instance, both acknowledging the form and function of racial slavery for any historical account of the rise of modern terror, and addressing the ways that, in Agamben's words, the political economy of statehood, particularly in Africa, has dramatically changed over the last quarter of the 20th century in connection with the wars of the globalization era. Necropolitics is important for the historicist project of provincializing Agamben's paradigmatic analysis, especially as it articulates the logic of race as something far more global than a conflict internal to Europe or its border with Eurasia. Indeed, Mbembe initially describes racial slavery in the Atlantic world as, quote, one of the first instances of biopolitical experimentation, and goes on to discuss it, following the work of Hartman, as an exemplary manifestation of the state of exception in the very structure of the plantation system and its aftermath. However, Mbembe abandons too quickly this meditation on the peculiar institution in pursuit of the proper focus of his theoretical project, the formation of colonial sovereignty. In the process, he loses track of the fact, set forth in the opening pages of Hartman's study, that the crucial aspects of the peculiar terror formation that Mbembe attributes to the emergence of colonial rule are in fact already institutionalized in and as the political juridical structure of slavery. More specifically, it is the legal and political status of the captive female that is paradigmatic for the reproduction of enslavement in which, as Hartman has it, the normativity of sexual violence, that is, the virtual absence of prohibitions and limitations in the determination of socially tolerable and necessary violence, establishes an inextricable link between racial formation and sexual subjection. This is why, for Hartman, resistance is figured through the black female's sexual self-defense, as exemplified by the 1855 Circuit Court case, State of Missouri v. Celia, a slave, in which the defendant was sentenced to death by hanging on the charge of murder for responding with deadly force to the sexual assault of a white male slaveholder. Having engaged Hartman, then, Mbembe must write the following under the terms of a certain disavowal. Quote, "The most original feature of this terror formation, the colony, is its concatenation of biopower, the state of exception, and the state of siege. The colony represents the site where sovereignty consists fundamentally in the exercise of power outside the law, and where peace is more likely to take on the face of a war without end." In the earlier text, Hartman describes, quote, "the particular mechanisms of tyrannical power that converge on the black body, highlighting both the absoluteness of power under slavery in general and the particular ways that its gender dimensions reveal that generality at its extreme." She writes, "In this instance, tyranny is not a rhetorical inflation, but a designation of the absoluteness of power. Gender, if at all appropriate in this scenario, must be understood as indissociable from violence. The vicious refiguration of rape as mutual and shared desire, the wanton exploitation of the captive body tacitly sanctioned as a legitimate use of property, the disavowal of injury, and the absolute possession of the body and its issue. In short, black and female difference is registered by virtue of the extremity of power operating on captive bodies and licensed within the scope of the humane and the tolerable." Mbembe's formulation can suggest the originality of colonial sovereignty only insofar as it bypasses Hartman's evidence and argument. In fact, it does so by artfully recuperating the very sources that Hartman brings in for critique. And this is what piqued my interest in Mbembe's article after reading it a second and a third and a fourth time. In note 30 of Necropolitics, Mbembe cites affirmatively Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, among other sources, in support of his claim that the very structure of the plantation system and its aftermath manifests the emblematic and paradoxical figure of the state of exception. In notes 34 and 36 of the same article, however, Mbembe cites affirmatively two sources in contradiction of Hartman's position. The first is the well-known passage from the 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in which the narrator describes the terrible spectacle of the torture of his Aunt Hester by the overseer, Mr. Plummer. And the second is the work of folklorist Roger Abrahams on the form and function of corn shucking as slave performance in the antebellum United States. Now, it's curious that Mbembe avails himself of these particular references, given that in the second paragraph of the first pages of Scenes of Subjection, Hartman states the following: "I have chosen not to reproduce Douglass's account of the beating of Aunt Hester in order to call attention to the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated, the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequences of this routine display of the slave's ravaged body. Rather than inciting indignation, too often they immure us to the pain by virtue of their familiarity, and especially because they reinforce the spectacular character of black suffering." For these reasons, Hartman explicitly rejects such invocations of the shocking and the terrible as a means to convey the routinized violence of slavery and its aftermath, opting instead to consider those scenes in which terror can hardly be discerned: slaves dancing in the quarter, the outrageous darky antics of the minstrel stage, the constitution of humanity in slave law, and the fashioning of the self-possessed individual. That is to say, the reiteration and circulation of passages like Douglass's description of Aunt Hester's torture do not help to establish for readers the violent tenor of the slave's life, as Mbembe would have it, but rather serve to obscure and to naturalize it. In pursuit of her thesis, Hartman challenges the prevailing modes of historical writing about slavery, including the sort of folkloric ethnography for which Abraham's gained an international scholarly reputation. Hartman extends the work of Hayden White in reading the text of Abraham's 1992 Singing the Master as typical of the pastoral genre that implots history as a comic romance. She writes, when history is implotted in the comic mode, its mode of historical explanation tends to be organicist and its ideological implications conservative. Abrahams celebrates the capacities of the slave to subvert the regime through her signifying beyond the master's awareness and comprehension. But Hartman demonstrates how this celebration relies upon an erasure of the structural violence, what she calls hardly discernible terror, of compelled performance. Mbembe thus defends Abraham's American pastoral against Hartman's criticism when he mobilizes the former as support for the idea that, quote, in spite of the terror and the symbolic sealing off of the slave, he or she maintains alternative perspectives toward time, work, and self. This is the second paradoxical element of the plantation world as a manifestation of the state of exception. Treated as if he or she no longer existed except as a mere tool, an instrument of production, the slave, nevertheless, is able to draw almost any object, instrument, language, or gesture into a performance and then stylize it. Breaking with uprootedness and the pure world of things of which he or she is but a fragment, the slave is able to demonstrate the protean capabilities of the human bond through music and the very body that was supposedly possessed by another, end quote. Mbembe's conjectural phrasing here, asserting a supposed possession of the body rather than a political juridical order that enforces its actuality, has the effect of diminishing the violence of slave law in the very scenes of subjection that Hartman shows to be central to the construction of racial difference and what she calls the absolute distinctions of status between free white persons and black captives. It also seeks to discredit the scholarship that operates according to such assumptions. Put differently, it seeks to resurrect the same problematic attributions of humanity, agency, and personhood that Hartman identifies as key components of the racial domination of blacks in the tragic continuities between slavery and freedom. Uncritical and ultimately romantic ethnographic claims, like those Mbembe draws upon about the slave's capacity and capability for stylization, become theoretically untenable since the publication of Scenes of Subjection, now almost 15 years ago. And I'm talking broadly here about the sort of claims about slavery that rely on phrases like, in spite of the terror, and nevertheless. Now, this is not evidence of oversight or lack of rigor, but rather misrecognition of the theoretical level at which Hartman's critique is posed. Mbembe's misconstrued engagement with Hartman makes more than likely a disavowal of the transatlantic connection of categorical eligibility for enslavement that racial slavery forges among African-derived populations. He does this in favor of a, quote, third worldist conception of the colonized, warranting analytic comparison and political solidarity between the sub-Saharan African post-colony and the living legacy of colonialism in the Middle East. What the latter share, according to Mbembe, is a problematic of decolonization, broached by way of a subsumption of slavery under the rubric of colonialism, making of slavery one more instance of a general phenomenon, what Mbembe calls modern terror, or the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. This emphasis on generalized instrumentalization goes some way in explaining how Mbembe can justify theoretically a leap from a discussion of the, quote, death-in-life commerce of racial slavery from the mid-16th century Dutch Golden Age to the formation of the mid-20th century apartheid regime to the broader political economy of statehood in the African post-colony to what he calls the ongoing colonial occupation of Palestine, the most accomplished form of necropower in the contemporary world. Those are Mbembe's terms. The generalized instrumentalization of human existence spanning across these distinct, if overlapping, social formations is a regrettably imprecise thesis, and as a result loses track of the singular commodification of human being under racial slavery, that structure of gratuitous violence in which a body is rendered as flesh to be accumulated and exchanged, that figure, in other words, with which Mbembe opens the Necropolitics article. This sort of conceptual conflation is pronounced in recent discussions of racial inequality in the United States as well, where post-colonial immigration and indigenous anti-colonialism constitute the poles of a strange and uneasy political continuum. Now, I have a lot more to say about that last sentence, because you're like, and explain, please. But I don't want to go into all of this here, because I talked about it at some length in both of these articles, in fact. And I can talk about it in Q&A, of course, if you like. Or I can talk about it right now if you just want me to stop and start the discussion. But I did want to say just a bit about what I think connects this difficulty in understanding the history and afterlife of slavery across the field of what I'm calling cultural studies broadly, and a kind of strife or difficulty internal to the field of Black studies. I think that there's about those same questions, right, about the history of slavery and its afterlife. I want to try to connect what might seem to be an internal or intramural dispute to these broader sort of conflation, slippages, problems in the field of, call it, comparative ethnic studies more generally. So, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. This section is shorter than the first, so we can get to it in short order. This is the section on the afterlife of slavery. Okay, now aside from acknowledging the growth in social, cultural, economic, and geographic histories of slavery in the last 20 years, and that the expansion of that literature is very important, because it suggests that what we thought we knew about the enormity, the profundity of slavery is actually only sort of a fraction of the picture, which with each new publication we learn more about the depth, the complexity, and the scope and scale of racial slavery. But aside from acknowledging that literature, which I can't discuss here, this section attempts to explore an emergent tension between formulations of afro-pessimism, what's called afro-pessimism, and Black optimism within the field of Black studies, offered respectively by Frank Wilderson's 2010 text, Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, on the one hand, and Fred Moten's recent series of articles in the journals Criticism, PMLA, and the New Centennial Review. Now, the wager here is that what might seem at first to be a highly technical dispute in a small corner of the American Academy might reveal itself to be a kind of illuminating commentary on the guiding assumptions and operative terms in the field of Black studies particularly, but in the range of comparative ethnic studies or cultural studies more generally. This is in and beyond the United States. For Wilderson, what he calls afro-pessimism takes seriously the longue durée of social death in Atlantic history, and thereby pursues an investigation of the meaning of Blackness, not, as he puts it in the first instance, as a variously and unconsciously interpolated identity, or as a conscious social actor animated by legible political interests, but rather as a structural position of non-communicability in the face of all other positions, what Mbembe called the symbolic sealing off of the slave. Wilderson's procedure here involves the abstraction of a conceptual framework regarding structural positionality, a methodology regarding paradigmatic analysis, and a structure of feeling regarding the politics of antagonism that, taken together, remain implicit in the work of various luminaries of Black studies. I'm thinking here of Hortense Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, of course, the work of David Marriott, Ronald Judy, among others, but whose full implications only become available when they are rendered explicit and raised to another level of abstraction. And this, I might add, often to the discontent of the authors cited, right, kind of against their will in some ways. Right. Moten, in his turn, and I'm not saying that that's a problem, right? I'm not saying that's a problem. Moten, in his turn, forwards a notion of Black optimism drawn from his long-standing meditation on the relation between Black politics and Black musical performance, and this notion is meant, in part, to counter or reposition at least the premises of Afro-pessimism by holding the force of Black agency to be logically and ontologically prior to the construction of a social order characterized by anti-blackness. The resistance that constitutes constraint, as Moten phrases it. Now, I think it important that the shifting line of distinction progressively marked out between these theoretical tendencies turns in crucial ways on their real or imagined ability to think about what Wilderson calls the political ontology of race, not only alongside and through a history of capitalism and the emergence of the modern nation-state, but also with respect to formations of gender and sexuality as mutually constituting categories of differentiation. We're dealing here with both the challenges of analytical description and the desire for political prescription. Any claim about the contemporary persistence of black social death for an analysis of the afterlife of slavery must contend with the insistence of black social life, and vice versa. Put somewhat differently, something more complicated is afoot than the oft-noted dialectic of slavery and freedom, or power and resistance, something like an intimacy of the two terms that arrays them less as opposites and more as conditions of an impossible possibility. In the case of blackness, for instance, Moten is concerned with a strife internal to the field formation of black studies, internal, moreover, to the black radical tradition that black studies is, or seeks out, as institutional inscription, a strife, as he puts it, between normativity and the deconstruction of norms. Right? And he argues persuasively that this is essential not only to contemporary black academic discourse, but also to the discourses of the barbershop, the beauty shop, and the bookstore. There is a strife within the black radical tradition between what Moten calls radicalism, understood as the performance of a general critique of the proper, and a normative striving against the grain of the very radicalism from which the desire for norms is derived. Now, if radicalism gives rise to the desire for norms, like a river from source water or a tree from roots, if the general critique of the proper gives rise to the desire for propriety, in the fullest sense of the term, and not vice versa, then our prevailing notion of critique and the forms and sources of our critical activity is put profoundly into question, and rightly so. Moten finds examples of this prevailing notion of critique in a certain moment of Fanon, which I mentioned at the outset, and consequently in a citation or resonance of Fanon in a 2003 article entitled Raw Life, which I co-authored with my colleague Huey Copeland, who teaches now at Northwestern University. Copeland and I are addressed in this case to the extent that we are said to share, this is according to Moten, an epistemological consensus broad enough to include Fanon on the one hand and Daniel Patrick Moynihan on the other, encompassing formulations that might be said not only to characterize but also to initiate and reinitialize the philosophy of the human sciences, end quote. That's curious company, of course, but that's precisely the point. However, before we adjudicate whether the authors of Raw Life, or for that matter, Fanon himself, truly suffer from what Moten calls an explicatory velocity that threatens to abolish the distance between, which is to say, the nearness of, a whole range of conceptual pairs requiring a finer attunement to their difference and its modalities. Right? I think prior to that, it's paramount to adjudicate whether the fact that blackness has been associated with a certain sense of decay, this is Moten's terms, is in the first instance something that we ought to strain against, even as it strains against us. All right? And even if in the last instance we decide to stay the course, right, and to oppose the association of blackness with decay and with death beyond that, need we mobilize a philosophy of life in order to do so, right? To interrogate what Donna Jones calls the racial discourses of life philosophy is to demonstrate that the question of life cannot be pried apart from that thorniest of problems, what Nahum Chandler calls the problem of the Negro as a problem for thought. That dubious and doubtless fact of blackness, or what I'll call in yet another register, the social life of social death. The question that remains is whether a politics that affirms social life can avoid the thanatological dead end if it does not will its own social death. David Marriott might call this, with Fanon, quote, the need to affirm affirmation through negation, not as a moral imperative, but as a psychopolitical necessity. As noted, Patterson first developed the concept in question, social death, for an academic audience in his 1982 study. And surprisingly little elaboration followed in the wake of his intellectual contribution and the minor controversy that it spurred in the early 80s. Remember, this is the era of the Reagan administration. That debate generally invoked a caricature of the concept of social death as already debunked, and this from within the field of history and black studies at their intersection. The negative estimation is twofold. On the one hand, Patterson is deemed unable and uninterested in writing history from the perspective of the dominated, which is to say, he's unable or uninterested in writing history for the dominated. On the other hand, Patterson nonetheless takes the liberty of speaking about the dominated, and the result is travesty. This is from his critics. Whereas Patterson's detractors take to task his historical sociology for its inability or unwillingness to fully countenance the agency of the perspective and self-predicating activity of the slaves, his supporters, or at least those engaging his work through a more generous critique, do not fail to remark, even if they rarely highlight, that what is most stunning in Patterson's work is the fact that the concept of social death cannot be generalized. It is indexed to slavery, and it does not travel. That is to say, there are problems in the formulation of the relation of power from which slavery arises, and there are problems in the formulation of the relation of this relation of power to other relations of power, say colonialism. This split reading was evident immediately, as indicated, for instance, in a contemporaneous review by Ross Baker. Baker observes against the neoconservative backlash politics of angry white males and the ascendance, this is in the 80s again, and the ascendance of another racialized immigration discourse alternating post-civil rights between model minority and barbarians at the gate. Baker writes, quote, "The mere fact of slavery makes black Americans different. No amount of tortured logic could permit the analogy to be drawn between a slave population and an immigrant population, no matter how low-flung the latter group," end quote. Baker's refusal of analogy in the wake of his reading of Patterson is pegged to a certain realization brought home, as he puts it, by the daunting force of Patterson's description of the bleak totality of the slave experience. Those are Baker's words. Now, I want to hold on to this perhaps unwitting distinction that Baker draws between what he calls the mere fact of slavery on the one hand, and the daunting force of description of the slave experience on the other. In this distinction, Baker echoes both the problem identified by Moten in his reading of Raw Life as a sort of a conflation of the fact of blackness with the lived experience of the black. But it also resonates with the problem identified by Hartman in Scenes of Subjection of a certain conflation of witness and spectator before the scenes of subjection at the heart of slavery. Now, I concede that Moten's delineation is precise and that it encourages a more sophisticated theoretical practice. What I'm questioning is the pertinence of that rejoinder. But Hartman's conclusion, it seems to me, is also accurate in a sort of non-contradictory coincidence or overlap with Moten that situates black studies in a relational field that's still generally under-theorized. Rather than approaching the theorization of social death and the theorization of social life as an either-or proposition then, I've heard now pronouncements from a number of folks who say they simply don't believe in social death, as if that's what you can do with concepts, just not believe in them or not. Right? But rather than thinking of them as an either-or proposition, why not attempt to think them as a matter of both and? Why not articulate them through the supplementary logic of the copula? In fact, there might be a more radical rethinking available yet. What I find most intriguing at this point about the timbre of black optimism is the way in which it works away from the discourse of black pathology, but only to swerve right back into it, while ascribing it to those deemed to be taking up the stance of the pathologist in relation to black folks, whether that be Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Fanon or yours truly. I say this not only because there is, in this version of events, a recourse to psychoanalytic terminology, fetishization, obsession, repetition. This is all in the Moten pieces and in the larger article where I read it. But also because there is, at the heart of the matter, a rhetorical question. So why is it repressed? That's the rhetorical question. What is the it that has been afflicted by repression, this psychopathology of obsessional neurosis, right? It's the understanding of the ontological priority or previousness of blackness relative to the anti-blackness that establishes itself against it, right? It's the priority or previousness that is also termed by Moten knowledge of freedom. So in the discourse of afro-pessimism, as black optimism responds, there is repressed knowledge of freedom. That's the argument. What does not occur here in the discourse of black optimism is a consideration of the possibility that something might be unfolding in the project or the projections of afro-pessimism, knowing full well the danger of a kind of negative reification associated with its analytical claims to the paradigmatic. In other words, this might not be repression, it might be withholding. Something different. In a way, what we're talking about relates not to the disagreement about unthought positions and their deformation, but to a disagreement or a discrepancy about unthought dispositions and their information. I would maintain this insofar as the misrecognition at work regards, and this is perhaps ironic, the performative dimensions or signifying aspect of a generalized impropriety in afro-pessimism, which is so improper as to appear as the same old propriety returning through the back door. Without sufficient consideration of the gap between statement and enunciation here, to say nothing of quaint notions like context or audience or historical conjuncture, the discourse of afro-pessimism can only seem like a, quote, tragically neurotic instance of a certain discourse on the relation between blackness and death. Right? What I'm saying, in essence, is when asking about the discourse of afro-pessimism, it's perhaps more important to ask not what are they saying, but why are they trying to say what they're saying, and why now? And I'll end on this next passage. The bell is tolling, you know. In a discussion of Du Bois on the study of black folk, Lewis Gordon, to bring him back into the conversation, restates an existential phenomenological conception of the anti-black world developed across his first several books. He writes, blacks here suffer the phobogenic reality posed by the spirit of racial seriousness. In effect, they more than symbolize or signify various social pathologies. They become them. In the anti-black world, blacks are pathology. Now, this conception would seem to support Moten's contention that even much radical black study scholarship sustains this problematic association of blackness with a sense of decay, and thereby fortifies and extends this interlocutory life of widely accepted political common sense, right? In a sense, remaining in league with Moynihan. In fact, it would seem that Gordon deepens this problematic association to the level of identity, right? To wit, blacks, they are pathology, right? And yet, this is precisely what Gordon argues is the value and insight of Fanon. Fanon fully accepts the definition of himself as pathological as it is imposed by a world that knows itself through that imposition, rather than remaining in a reactive stance that insists on the heterogeneity or difference between a self and an imago originating in culture. Though it may appear counterintuitive, rather, because it is counterintuitive, this affirmation of the pathological is active. It is a willing, or willingness, in other words, to pay whatever social costs accrue to being black, to inhabiting blackness, to living a black social life under the shadow of social death. This is not an accommodation to the dictates of the anti-black world. The affirmation of blackness, which is to say an affirmation of pathological being, is a refusal to distance oneself from blackness in a valorization of minor differences that bring one closer to health, to life, to sociality. Fanon writes in the first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, quote, "A Senegalese who learns Creole in order to pass for Antillean is a case of alienation. The Antillians, who in turn make a mockery out of him, are lacking in judgment." In a world structured by the twin axioms of white superiority and black inferiority, of white existence and black non-existence, a world structured by a negative categorical imperative, quote, above all, don't be black. In this world, the 0 degree of transformation is the turn toward blackness, a turn toward the shame that, as Tavia Nyong'o writes, quote, resides in the idea that I am thought of as less than human. That's an understatement if I ever heard one. In this, we might create a transvaluation of pathology itself, something like the embrace of pathology without pathos. To speak of black social life and black social death, against social death, as social death, in social death, all of this is to find oneself in the midst of an argument that is also a profound agreement, an agreement that takes shape in between misrecognition and disbelief. Black optimism is not the negation of the negation that is afro-pessimism, just as black social life does not negate black social death by vitalizing it. A living death is as much a death as it is a living. And nothing in afro-pessimism suggests that there is no black social life, only that black life is not social in the universe formed by the codes of state and civil society, citizen and subject, nation and culture, people and place, history and heritage, of all the things that colonial society has in common with the colonized, of all that capital has in common with labor, what we call, in short, the modern world system. Black life is not lived in the world that the world lives in, but it is lived underground or in outer space. This much is agreed. That is to say, what is asserted against afro-pessimism is a point already affirmed by afro-pessimism. It is, in fact, one of the most polemical dimensions of afro-pessimism as a project, namely, that black life is not social, or rather, that black life is lived in social death. Double emphasis on lived and on death. And that's the whole point of the enterprise at some level. It's all about the implications of this agreed upon point where arguments should begin, but they cannot yet proceed. Afro-pessimism is an analysis of the law in its operation as police power and racial prerogative, both under and after slavery, as Brian Wagner terms it. So too is black optimism, or at least that just less than half of the intellectual labor of black optimism committed to the object of black studies as what Cedric Robinson calls the critique of the anti-blackness of Western civilization. But black optimism is just that much more interested in how black social life steals away or escapes from the law, how it frustrates the police power, and in so doing calls that very policing into being in the first place. The policing of black freedom, then, is aimed less at its dreaded prospect, apocalyptic rhetoric notwithstanding, than it is at its irreducible precedence. The logical and ontological priority of black freedom, of the unorthodox, self-predicating activity of blackness, of what Moten calls the improvisational exteriority or immanence that blackness is, it renders the law dependent on what it polices. But this is not the noble agency of resistance. It's a reticence or a reluctance that we might not know if it were not pushing back, so long as we know that this pushing back is really a pushing forward. So in this perverse sense, black social death is black social life. The object of black studies is the aim of black studies. The most radical negation of the anti-black world is the most radical affirmation of a blackened world. Afro-pessimism is not, but nothing other than, black optimism. Thanks. How are we doing? I heard the bell toll. We still have some time for some discussion. Yeah? Questions, comments, clarifications, objections? Here's this jazz legend, right? Nobody can hear him. He goes to step out on the stage, and the drummer says, "Get back, get off the stage. You don't interrupt the session once it's started, because we can hear him, and he can hear himself. We don't really care if the audience can hear or not." If there's not a better way to sort of dramatize this social life in social death, right? How the the social death would be, of course, the absence of sound, right? That sealing off, right, symbolically, of the performance, where the audience is rendered as spectacle, right, or spectator, but not participant in the way that the ensemble is. The microphone might go on, it might go off, it doesn't really matter, right? That's essentially what the drummer was saying. We're not here because of the microphone. We're here because of what is being produced on this stage. Everything else is just sort of secondary, kind of a byproduct. So that's a way in which I think that you can look at that social life. There's no need, to deny it. It's to say, but what does it mean in the rest of the world, right? I think that's where the dispute starts to break down. It's in the kind of, how should I say, the ontological reach of that performance, right? Not what it does or doesn't do, intramurally, as Spillers would put it, but what does it do globally? That's the question. That's the question. So that's a way that I would want to at least start talking about, as an example, that difficult and strange relation between social life and social death. Is that helpful? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Seeing sort of a reciprocity between sort of black social death and social life,
mm-hmm.
and what happens in relationship to white social life and social death. Is there reciprocity? Is black optimism, what is this relationship to white, or black pessimism, should I say? Mm-hmm. What is this relationship to white optimism? Mm-hmm. And in the second part, I guess, of this question is, in terms of black optimism, do you see any space for the sort of traditional African-American Christian sort of, existential sort of way of being in the world as a sign of hope or dismay, especially, for example, in the writings of Du Bois,
mm-hmm.
The Souls of Black Folk, where in every one of these chapters he's articulating, this almost religious narrative of black experience,
mm-hmm.
Trying to articulate redemption,
mm-hmm.
even as he sort of realizes all around him is the trail of tears of the black experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm trying to think of a way to speak to this. See, I would probably talk about the black church the way I would talk about the jazz ensemble, in terms of, what I said in the paper is that black social life does not negate social death by vitalizing it. It may sustain those who live under social death or live within social death, but it doesn't negate that social death at the same time. And this is, and I think part of the, this is part of the problem that Du Bois was trying to think about across the long career, 70 years of writing, where he comments, just to give you one example, at the end of the Philadelphia Negro in 1899, this is one of his earliest works, before The Souls of Black Folk, where he speaks at the turn of the century about the growing acceptance of the idea of a general humanity in the world. This is what he says. We're in this moment, he says, but it's still slow going. And he says, the Anglo-Saxon, whatever that might mean, is considered the pinnacle of civilization. We reluctantly accept the Celt and the Slav. We half admit, right, what he calls the yellow races of Asia, and we kind of begrudgingly acknowledge the, quote, brown Indian on the basis of an indisputable past. He says, but when we come to the Negroes of Africa, we reach a full stop, period, right? So what he's trying to articulate there is something about what the cultural logic of racial slavery produced, not just in the Mediterranean world where it emerges, or even in the Atlantic world that it eventually begins to encompass, but in terms of a global sensibility, what would become our concepts of the idea of a world system, of a global civil society, and of a global economy as well. He's trying to get at something about this notion of the veil, right, that one can see through but can't be seen through it. I think that this is what he's trying to talk about. Where social death and social life come together in this is that he also talks about that existence behind the veil as a gift, right? This is why I think Moten is saying that, yes, I don't deny social death, but what I see in it is a terrible, beautiful vitality, right? That as much as it is, right, as Rita Dove's poem says, right, the production of the most wretched, right, degraded and abject beings since the world began, it's also the place where knowledge of freedom is produced. The only place where knowledge of freedom is produced, right? You have to be a slave to want to be free, right? You see? So I think that's the way in which we can stick to this doubleness of it. Without it, I mean, the ideas of pessimism and optimism they're a little bit misleading, aren't they? In this sense, not only because we can think of how you can be both optimistic and pessimistic depending on your register, Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, but of how when we really look at this paradigm, questions of optimism and pessimism really get displaced altogether, right? We have to formulate some other structure of feeling to even think about it. Yeah, so I think that's, and Du Bois is very helpful for that, as is Fanon, but you kind of have to brush them against the grain in some ways. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Great.
So I'd like to go back to the.
Go ahead.
Go back to the example of Sonny Rollins.
Yeah.
Performance. So at the point that the mic goes off, there's a communication between the members of the band.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking that there's a pessimistic discourse or conversation that occurs. For instance, I'm thinking of George Jackson.
Yeah.
And Soledad Brother, and then the way that conversation that he's having with a particular community gets kind of interpolated once it goes outside.
Yeah.
So once the spectator or that voice hits other ears, what happens to it? Who is the audience, I guess, for the afro-pessimism kind of discourse?
Well, I think you've identified it in a way. If we were to stay with Sonny Rollins, if Sonny Rollins and his ensemble were thinking first and foremost about what was going to resonate most with the broadest popular audience, their music would be terrible, wouldn't it? They would never make the music that they make, right? The focus is intensive, not extensive. And I think that's what we see again in a different register in the writings of someone like George Jackson, who's meditating with a kind of unrelenting and unflinching sort of focus, right, on his position, right, and those who are adjacent to it. I think that's what he's trying to do, to get depth in it rather than trying to preempt that thinking with an immediate gesture for commonality, for analogy, and so forth and so on, and for breadth and for generality. If those connections are possible in the second instance, so be it. Just like if the audience can hear Sonny Rollins play, so be it. But if they don't, right, the music still goes on. I think that's at least a way that we could formulate these questions of address and of audience and constituency, to use a kind of grand term, right? That help? Yeah. I saw some hands over here. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I'm a lot of I'm not a theorist, does living practice look like within social death ever change? Considering the legacy of slavery, historical fact, and then the racial phenomena of blackness,
Right.
What's going on now, what's going on in the future, there's other issues.
Right. Yeah, is there such a thing as a historical development, right? What's the force of history? Is this a dynamic situation? I would say yes, of course, and no, of course, right? And Hartman is my guide in this. When she talks about the continuities between slavery and freedom, what she's doing is sort of disabusing us of a certain reliance upon emancipation, capital E, right, that we've used to periodize at least the history of the United States, but there are other emancipation proclamations throughout the Atlantic world that we talk about the age of abolition and the age of emancipation, and we talk with all seriousness about post-emancipation societies, right? She's also in some ways refusing the relief that we might feel, right? That emancipation was what it said it was. But also in the notion of the afterlife of slavery, she's encouraging us to sort of drop the bad habit of talking about the legacy of slavery, for instance, the aftermath of slavery. What comes after slavery? She says what comes after slavery is the afterlife of slavery. Slavery keeps living after emancipation, right? And slavery keeps living after the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation. And slavery keeps living after the election of the first black president of the United States, and so on and so forth. When folks start pointing to the empirical variety and diversity of black populations as a way to say, well, it's obviously this is a post-emancipation situation, right? They forget the fact that there has always been diversity and variety of material situation, right, in the New World for black populations. That much is not new, but it's within these sort of lower level frequencies, right? What we talk about is the sort of deep currents of our political culture, right? Not to mention the sort of structure of our political economy and so forth and so on, that we can see the ways in which there is this afterlife of slavery. We're stuck in a crisis of language and a sort of analytical problem about how to describe it. All we have is recourse to these really anemic indicators like infant mortality and rates of poverty and rates of incarceration, for that matter. They're important to understand, but they don't begin to tell the story about the ways in which racial slavery becomes structuring, formative, generative for what we now talk about as the modern world, right? Not just economically useful, not just politically useful, right? But foundational for what we would even call the economic, the political, the social, the philosophical, right? That the most fundamental concepts, as Agamben says, that we've used to represent the subject of the political, they have to be abandoned. Decidedly and without reservation, we must have a renewal of categories. We must rebuild our political philosophy from the ground up. In this case, around the one and only figure of the slave, because we haven't yet done that. That's the page that I take out of Agamben's book, right? Yeah, yeah.
I have a question about how do you see other intersections, like gender in relation specifically for me in these like trans identity, and specifically I don't identify as someone who's both black and trans, but someone who the notion of like not being able to pass as like an identifiable human form, because gender is something which constructs our notions of what is human as well, or I feel. Like, how does that have a stake in this? And specifically for people who have no access to having a job and therefore like have to sell and trade their bodies and sex work. And it's not necessarily slavery, that
Right.
history of slavery.
Right.
I have no say in that. But yeah, just how do you
Yeah, you're talking about, if I'm understanding you, how do we think about things like the economy of sex work and the ways in which it intersects as and functions as forced labor in many cases, relies upon, if not economic
for
core.
people who cannot pass in a capitalist system.
Right.
Because they do not identify as something like a
right? Right. How do we think about it as forced labor without making recourse right away to the question, to the history of slavery as such? And how do we think about this afterlife of slavery with respect to categories of gender and the deconstruction of gender in so many ways? These are crucial questions, and I think one of the ways that we can think about it, I mean, in addition to looking at what Hartman, Spillers, and others have that I've mentioned here have written as well, I want to also refer folks to the work of a German scholar named Sabine Breck, who was just down at the Irvine campus, I want to say 2 weeks ago, where she delivered a really great paper about the history of the concept of gender and the related concept of sexuality as essentially white categories of differentiation of human being. And what she was arguing in this piece, and which I think is drawing from some of the tenets of afro-pessimism, even if it's only a kind of an indirect reference, is the ways in which we cannot think about the modern categories that we now have of gender and sexuality, in some cases very recently emerging categories of sexuality in particular, as if they are pre-modern phenomenon. In other words, they emerge within the same modern formation that depends upon the matrix of racial slavery to construct that fundamental difference between the human and the anti-human. Not the non-human, but the anti-human, that which is the antithesis of the human. Now you say, well, there's always been concepts of peoplehood. Yeah, there have, but not of a human, capital H, with some kind of global reach. That's a modern phenomenon. And it emerges in this fundamental distinction between that which can be turned into property, and I mean property for accumulation and exchange on a global market, as commerce for profit, and that which cannot. Now, if we were to think that way, we would have to say, well, how do we think about the production of gender under slavery? Not over slavery, but under it. It immediately puts the categories of gender as Hartman said, if it's at all applicable in this case, right? Gender becomes indissociable, right? Inextricable from the deployment of violence in extremity. So if we were to think of gender as being produced in that matrix or relation of forces and of violence, we would have to write a different history of gender, which doesn't just understand it as intersecting with race, right, but as emerging out of the world that slavery creates, right? In other words, that it would be a concept of civil society where civil society does not exist for the enslaved. Now, does that mean that there are not gendered dimensions to slavery? No, of course not. It doesn't mean that. It means that the analysis that emerges from that will be fundamentally different from that which is understood on the other side of that line of propertized human being, as Cheryl Harris puts it. So it's a question that gets us started. In other words, we would need to have a post-slavery critique. I don't have a good phrase for it, but a post-slavery critique of gender and sexuality, as we would have to have a post-slavery critique of the formation of categories of class. Steve Martino, for instance, has done some of that work in his couple of books, The Rule of Racialization, and a few others, about the ways in which you can't think about class as intersecting with race. You have to think about it as historically produced, right, out of the matrix of racial slavery. That class actually is not a category available to the enslaved, and so forth and so on. So that's how I would begin to answer that, and to always caution that we be precise in our terminology. What you see is a sort of ubiquity of the rhetoric of slavery in political discourse on the left. Everything is a type of slavery, on the one hand, which should alert us to the fact that no one is thinking about slavery; they're just using the word, right? Because if it's everything, then it's nothing. So that's where we can begin to start in that symptomatic use, I should say, use and abuse of the term. We're at least on the track of the right sets of problems. Yeah. 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 One or two? Is there just the two? Let's do these two. Yeah.
I'm really curious about the term afterlife of slavery.
Yeah.
Because it seems not so much like an afterlife, but like a living ghost, but not like a being that exists as this entity that is still happening and walking among us and inside of us, and so it's an interesting concept to me. I'm just trying to figure out like how to unpack that.
Yeah.
Because like what I'm used to hearing is the aftermath of slavery,
Yeah.
or the history of slavery, or you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, I know for myself that that's not what's happening, but I'm really interested in like elevating the conversation to actually look at how it's a living and breathing afterlife, but not really.
But not really. Okay, and before I answer that, let me ask what your question is, and then I'll try to address the two of them.
It's a little bit of a segue, actually, between, I think, your explanation of using terms kind of generally.
Yeah.
And then right before you started, you shifted gears into talking about the afterlife of slavery.
Yeah, okay.
You had kind of changed gears in the direction you were going, and you had mentioned the post-colonial immigration. And so I was curious as to that topic, your ideas that, maybe hearing a little bit more about that, and particularly how it relates to the concept of people-of-color.
Okay. Big question, but good question. They're actually both related. I'm not even sure which article it is now, but in the longer version of one of the articles that I was drawing from here, I talked about this idea that slavery lives on not because of its political power to withstand challenges. I'm asking this. Maybe it's not because the pro-slavery forces are just so politically strong that they can retrench, make some concessions, and then come back on us. Maybe it's because the reason why slavery doesn't die and lives on is because it never really lived in the political imagination of the free in the first place. That maybe it is so profoundly illegible, right? The violence, the permanent state of violence that slavery constructs for itself in order to create a permanent state of freedom from violence, right, for those on the other side of the equation, that maybe it is so essential, so illegible, that it doesn't even need a defense which is self-conscious, right? That, I think, if we were to think about this and explore this rigorously as a collective enterprise, right, historically, sociologically, philosophically, politically, economically, if we were to think in this way, I think that the idea of the afterlife of slavery, as valuable as I found this from Hartman's work, even that has to be radicalized further, right? Because it would even that notion takes note of, pays a certain concession to the dominant understanding, the historical periodization of a before and after, right? Even if it insists that the after is not as great as people think it is, and it's not as after as they think it is, it's still engaged in that sort of dominant way of understanding things. We would have to reconfigure the way that we understand slavery in the first place to really knock out that notion, which looks at dates like 1865, for instance, and says there is a before and after, right? And that's what I mean by the idea that our conception of slavery is growing by leaps and bounds, thanks to the diligent work of researchers, but also it forces us back to the running commentary, right, that black cultural production in all of its various guises has been formulating for several centuries now. What we talk about as the black radical imagination or the black radical tradition, that scene of Sonny Rollins, right, playing without sound, so to speak. That understanding of slavery puts a mic on the horn for all of us, right, intramurally as well. So I think that this is that's a way in which we could start to rethink it, to stop presuming we understand what slavery is in the first place, and to ask that question: what then is slavery, really? Not simply the exploitation of labor, right? Not simply the denial of rights and liberties, not simply, and so on and so forth, but to say, what is the world that slavery made possible? To ask it in that way, I think that we would have a different conception. And this relates then to how to think slavery in relation to these other relations of power. Colonialism in particular, I think, is essential to this. I'm now trying to prepare an article on the relationship between slavery and colonialism as part of a sort of ongoing attempt to think relationships between categories of racial blackness and categories of Indianness or indigeneity throughout the Americas. It's a dialogue that should have happened, never did happen. It's a discourse that should have happened, never did happen, and not for no reason, right? But one of the things that I think we can begin to do is to look at how it was that before we have a European colonial enterprise in the proper sense in the 15th century, rather the 16th century, we have already the formation of a race-based system of slave trading throughout the Atlantic basin, or the Mediterranean basin, right? We're talking 1440s, 1450s, 1460s. We're talking a half century or more before there is even an idea of Columbus, going west from the Iberian Peninsula. We already have, in the formation of this new idea called Europe, a counterpoint, right, an antithesis, right, which is called that what we now think of as sub-Saharan Africa, that point beyond all intelligibility, right, for which North Africans, right, have to serve as interpreters and mediators, right? This is all happening prior to the instantiation of what we talk about as modern colonialism. So that by the time you have the first excursions, right, in the Spanish and Portuguese empires, you already have what Marx would later call the commercial hunting of black skins already, and that it enables the colonial enterprise in fundamental ways. More importantly, it drives that enterprise, right? There's an understanding of the relationship between colonialism and slavery which would say, well, it's the land which makes slavery possible. But it doesn't. Land only makes productive labor possible. But if you understand that slavery is not reducible to labor relations, that slavery is already a property relation, a lucrative one, before any work happens or whether any work happens, you understand that land is not necessary for slavery. First and foremost, because of the Middle Passage. Not a square foot of land in sight, but slavery happening on the high seas, right? So if we start from that understanding, we can see not that they're unrelated, right? Or that that we can think one exclusively, but that we better situate their actual relations. And on that basis, we can actually formulate a better idea of how to actually oppose them, right? All right, thanks.